Alrighty. Good morning. Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG. Today's Game Master's Guide is going to talk about the very scope of how your story can get started. If you haven't yet, click all the buttons down below to show that you're part of our audience, and let's get started, shall we? Alrighty, so we are going to talk about the scope of a story, and we're going to talk about a little bit about how your game might be defined, what parameters you're going to set, maybe a little bit on the elements of world building. We're going to talk about the unique story positioning you might bring to the game, how those will manifest, and how that will help to progress your story towards its completion. Now, we will talk about both serious topics and silly topics, so strap in and get ready for a fun little ride. So let's get started, shall we? Okay, so we're embarking on telling stories, and in particular, if you've never game mastered before, don't panic. Don't dive off the deep end and think that you have to do everything perfectly the first time. As a matter of fact, you won't, and that's going to be okay. What we're going to be talking about first are what we are going to use to contain your story, the adventure that you're trying to tell, so that we can keep it coherent. One of the biggest challenges that players. I've got a problem with my lights. Let me fix that. Ugh. So much better. I like it when I actually have flesh tone and I'm not just a white sheen. Oof. Anyway, we're going to talk about how to isolate and control the environment for your story, because one of the biggest challenges is that we try to do everything all at once. And although that may be the reality of how the universe really works, most of us understand that we need the concepts of time so that things don't all happen at once. So, we're going to be looking at the structure of your story. We're going to talk about what the elements are and how to control them. So, in this opening salvo, in this first start, we're going to set the broadest brush strokes possible. What is it that you want to tell? What story is it that you want to present to your players? And what frameworks can we put on that so that it is coherent and at the same time exciting for your players? Well, the first thing we're going to want to look at is the geography, the physical location. What does the world look like? As I've talked about in my nesting doll analogy that I've used before, we want to determine how big of a story do you want to tell, how expansive is it, and how much the players will be contributing to that story so that it will make sense for them. So obviously we're going to be looking at the geography, the geology, the very type of rock that is involved with, the climate, the environment, and all of those kind of things. But in the most common storytelling reference I can make, holding on to the elements of the story on really microscopic detail is counterproductive. We want to be able to describe the story, so think about what it is that impacts your life. What is it that you consider in the things that you do, and put those tools at the disposal of your players. That is how broad are the interactions they're going to have. Are they going to be dealing with people of various cultures, or are they going to be fundamentally culturally isolated within their own framework? Do they have does this realm, this fantasy that you have, include the very ideas of law abiding citizenry, or do we have a very strong police presence, military presence, governmental presence at all. Furthermore, does the extension of this story include the idea of conflict? Is this culture at war with another culture? Are there burdens placed upon the population based on unnameable fears and innumerable foes? Is it a war environment or a peaceful environment? The breadth and the possibility of these broad brushstrokes can be sweeping and can affect all kinds of things. And when you are first starting out, you need to kind of isolate which of these conflict levels you want to engage in. If a player is, for example, being required to engage with, martial military activity, are they seeing the enemy? Is it close enough that you're seeing them, or are you operating from behind defenses and such that it's isolated and somewhat antiseptic? Are the elements technological, or are they mystical? Are they magic? And finally, what are the actual dynamics? Are there going to be sweeping changes over the period of your story? Now, I realize that I've thrown a lot on the table here, and the real element here is that when we're building a story, we have to kind of drill down to what it is that the story needs to entail. So, allow me to give an example. In the case of the Nikos storyline, it's a large scale, taking between 6 and 7 real-time years of play to complete. So if a player is going to be engaged in the story of Nikos, they are invested for the long term. They have activities that will go on for the foreseeable future, and so therefore things don't change instantaneously. There are ways to change the world. There are ways to interact with the world, but the framing of it all is of a large enough scale that virtually any series of possibilities might come to be. And with that, therefore, the players in that story fundamentally are the drivers for it, because there's simply an infinite number of options. When you're first starting out, you're not going to be in a position to do that. So instead, consider what your limitations are, whether this is going to be a story that is going to describe the advancement of characters over time, or whether this is a slice of life, so to speak, that you're pursuing within the character's existence to see what they are made of and the like. So when you're talking about telling a story, even though we've now kind of expanded the horizons to make them almost unrecognizable, what is going to define your story? Now, the basic guidelines of story are to develop the concept of an arc, a beginning, a middle, and an end of the story. And whether that is a growth period piece where you're tracking someone from youth until adulthood, or adulthood to senior status, or the entire span of a person's life, you do have to have a beginning point. And generally, it's highly recommended that you utilize a session 0 or a beginning episode in order to start the storytelling. Now, some game masters prefer to not actually drive the story themselves, and they depend on the players to direct the advancement or the tempo and such of the adventure. But in the creation of a story that you as a game master are wishing to tell, you have to have at least an idea of what you want to accomplish. If it's merely the advancement of the players along their personal courses and you only want to help them achieve what they are wanting to accomplish, that itself is a story. And in setting up such a story course, you have to develop not only a concept of your starting point, but you have to get a feel for your pacing if you are trying to accomplish this story in a single episode, in a one shot, if you will. The arc has to be pretty close. You have to simply say, we are doing this one action and we're going to follow it through until its conclusion. Whereas if you are doing a series of maybe 6 or 8 adventures, you're telling a specific tale. What is the beginning parameter and what is the ending parameter, and look at how you're going to develop the pacing in order to achieve your goal in the amount of time that you've allotted for yourself. So if it is a 4-week arc, then you should have an idea of where the beginning is at the beginning of the episode, but by the end of the, say, second episode, you should be halfway done with your story. Start looking at how you're going to reach your crescendo and still have time to do the denouement, because the players are going to want to know how the story ends. And so figure out how to do that so that you're not running over your parameters. This also means that you need to develop what the checkpoints are along the way so that the players can feel their progress. This can be done through benchmarks, perhaps objectives, things that we're wanting to be taught. And then finally, how are you going to culminate it? How are you going to end that arc? Now, if you are a long-term game master and you're looking at how you're going to run a lifetime campaign, really don't sweat that as much as completing individual stories, because it is in the completion of the stories that you build the arc out little piece by little piece, so that the players don't feel the burden of history on them until later in the story, when they actually have taken some of the responsibility for those things. So then we come to the USPs, and this term is used all over the place nowadays, but the idea of a unique selling position or a unique story position is literally, what is it about your story that makes it your own? If you are utilizing, say, a fictional game world that exists and you're operating within that framework, that's, you're establishing to run a game in that environment. But is your story going to be unique to everyone else's? Of course, because you are the storyteller and your decisions are going to be your own. So that means that you need to have an idea of what it is that you're wanting to accomplish in your storytelling, so that the players can start to work towards either fulfilling what you're attempting to do or pursuing their own courses to accomplish it. And of course, this leads to the question, how do players facilitate the telling of a story? Well, if you are relating to them the details of the story without giving away the ending, which of course is optimal, then the players are going to make their own translations of the data that you've provided them, and therefore it will become something different from what you originally had in your focus. Because I think you're going to see something interesting here, is that as we look at the process of telling a story, you are actually discovering as much as you are describing. I compare these two elements kind of like the difference between a storefront window and the walking through the store. The idea of the window dressing is you seeing the outside parameters. Perhaps it's the outline of what you're trying to say, but once the players have entered the story and interacted, there's now going to be a better understanding and nuance of how they are interpreting and responding to the data, which therefore gives you the new flavor for your story. In doing so, you're providing the players with the engine for their development. And of course, their actions are going to have implications on the story overall. And realize also that if you've opened this up to player interpretation, then they, of course, are going to be determining what the consequences of their actions will be. And so, what you really have to determine is what are your parameters, what are your solid limits, and are there ways for them to be broken by the players? If the players have no agency, then the story is going to flat and be uninteresting to them. Whereas if they can adjust and alter the story, how do you allow that to happen, and what kind of a story will develop depends on what they do with what you provided them. In other words, if you're building a story, you're really trying to determine what the outcome will be in light of what the players might do. So you're actually trying to build the after of the story before it happens, so that their actions make the story make sense within the parameters you've given them. That means that what you're really building, in essence, for your story are the parameters, limits, and boundaries. Now, these are nuanced differences. Parameters are, of course, the operating system, so to speak, the method for their advancement, the decisions that they're allowed to be a part of. Limits are those things where they are pushing towards the edges and you are required to kind of help guide their direction so that they don't run off the edges, so to speak. And then finally, where are the hard line boundaries? What are the limits of what they can do? What are you going to restrict them in? And this is really a matter of looking at each one of these parameters, each one of these guidelines in the context of, are they intentional? Are they imposed externally? Are they merely recommendations? And when you have the players pursuing a course of action, will the story that they are telling override or undermine the very story that you originally started to tell? And if so, how do we push them back into the framework? And if not, how do we acknowledge those changes that the players have made? Because this will have a great impact on how they feel about the game. And after all, the element of a role-play game is the interaction between the players and the storyteller, so it's very important that you do not push them in such a way that you make it feel uncomfortable for them. So it really is a matter of being able to adapt that which you've created with what the players are attempting to do, and establishing the balance between them. And as I constantly say, it's a matter of making the story make sense. When the players do an action, it needs to be coherently interpreted in the framework of what the story has been so far, so that they're not driven crazy with the instability, but instead are allowed to make the changes in the world as they move. Now, this means that you really have to have a really solid handle on what it is the world looks like. And this is handled through narrative. One of the things that I have found really handy to do is begin our sessions with a reflection back to what has happened in the past. We call it OSSF, or Our Story So Far. And Our Story So Far is one of the ways that I'm able to take the initial story plan, if you will, the USP, and translate it through the filter of what has happened week over week. It means that I can telegraph the message that the story was intended to include, but while at the same time recognizing the player's impact and how they've altered it. And when you do this, you begin to kind of ride the wave, if you will, of cause and effect. As the players respond to the stimulus you've created, they now create courses and changes that affect the direction that your villains and your worldview is going to take. And so it creates this back and forth kind of progression of the story, almost step by step through, because it's utilizing the very framework that we've provided as the push off point, so that the player's direction can actually be using the story points against themselves, and allowing the collective, all of us that are at the table, to play with the dynamics of that story to cause it to progress further. This means that we can use narrative also to help determine the pacing. If the overarching story is they move from point A to point B, the narrative can explain how we've moved the method of conveyance, the means of the message, and the direction that we're taking can all be accomplished in a step-by-step and coherent fashion that allows the players to feel their activity within the framework and see the world change by their own actions. This elementally is the idea that we're going to provide the ability for the players to develop their progression through the story by moderating and measuring out the pacing of their story and looking at how greatly they are impacting the story, whether it be to a greater or a lesser extent. If they are, for example, a group of peasants and they are determined to cause a rebellion against the local government, how does that work? How do we amplify the importance of what the players do? Well, if their rebellion is starting to pick up steam in other areas, that means that they have had a major impact on the story. And this ability to affect and adjust the setting as a whole really provides a way to color the backdrop and the scenery of your episodes, so that the players can see that they've made a change. Perhaps they've done this in a fashion that has spawned some enemies, so now you might have some antagonist deterrent force that you're going to be able to bring to play with the games group coherently and logically, because they will have seen it, as compared to just foisting it upon them. Letting the player agency be the driver, letting it be the mechanism by which the story alters and changes, definitely also affects the trajectory. Do the actions of the group elevate, or do they downplay the framework? Are they acting within the rational thought processes of a person in the story, or are they merely triggering actions for other purposes? It's a matter of you as the storyteller making their actions part of the framework. Now, certainly you can set up certain safeguards, certain limits within the system that allow the story to push back and perhaps adjust the meter a bit. But the idea is that these elements that you bring to the game for your players have to be sort of in the form of stimulus or incentive, so that the players will see a reason to move forward in that direction. And at the same time, you have to look at the challenges that you place before them, because do you want them to be a hard parameter that requires the players to change their course, perhaps? Or are you looking for punching bags or MacGuffins to throw in front of them to merely adjust the pacing rather than their progression? That is to say, let's go again with this idea of a fictional rebellion. If there's going to be such a rebellion, is it going to be an easily determined one where the popular opinion is such that it should have happened perhaps long ago, but is only being driven by the players? Or is it a situation where it is going to be a tough fight and the common culture would actually stand against such an alteration of their lifestyles? And that means, what does the story end mean to the setting? Have you set the objectives such that when the players have reached the end of the story, the culmination of the objectives that you set before them, is that going to be changing forever the landscape of the world that they're living in? Or are they going to be simply a small cog in a larger, much more manipulated environment? And by having an idea of what they are doing at the end and how that has influenced the story overall, really helps to show their impact on the setting and the scenes in general. The point here is that the story that you are telling, whether it be an individual single shot adventure or whether it is a long tail saga, you want to show the advancing of the story throughout so that the players see that progression and recognize their part in it. The more you can provide the players with the emotional awareness of how important they've been to the story, the more likely they will come back for other episodes, because they're going to recognize what they have done to change the world. And that really is what the games are about. The truth of the matter is that the elements of interaction by the players are actually generating the how of the transition and the course that you had intended for them. And by giving players greater agency throughout, by feeding off of what they've come up with instead of outlining what must happen and therefore making them simply riders on your railroad, so to speak, you have given them the opportunity to make the world their own, and that will keep them playing week over week over week. So I want to thank you for being here with us for today. We will do more of these in the future. This is Jonathan Albin. This is a subset of the Game Masters Academy, and hope to hear from you soon about other issues. If you have any questions or comments about what you'd like me to do additional episodes on, let me know. I definitely am open to those kind of conversations, and I hope to see you again in another